Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Everyday Night. I'm Joe.
And I'm Jeff.
And Jeff,
Yes, Joe.
what are you drinking tonight? Let's
We've got
start right
we'll
there.
start right off with it. All right.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
I just I wasn't creative this evening. I just got some Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, um, a Buck brand 8-year-old bourbon, and
You
a
usually
little.
spend more than $1 on your bourbon.
Yeah, I do. I do. But that's what it's called, Buck. That's
Oh,
the name of it. That's the label. It's 8 years old and it's certified Kentucky bourbon. And I just threw some Fireball in there and some ice, and it's
okay.
it'll get me through this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And you, sir?
So I have a glass of Primitivo wine in my special glass.
Aha! Not a teacher's mug, but better.
Yes. Yes. Apparently, my friends who gave me this heard me say that more than once. So there you go.
Excellent.
Um, so tonight we are discussing uh, the virtue of loyalty, but
Yes,
as applied to employment.
right.
And
We've touched on this a couple of times.
we have, but we're devoting the whole episode to it. So employ loyalty, and this is not simply loyalty of an employer to an employee or an employee to employer, but both. Uh,
Yeah, we'll talk about it from both aspects.
yes. I had a colleague once who he told me he believed that when you are employed, you are essentially in fealty to your employer, and that to look for another job or consider another job was um, a violation, a breach of your fealty. And I explained that fealty is a two-way contract.
Hmm.
And the what I realized is the essential premise of what we're talking about now is that that relationship, that contract, social contract in some ways, that contract, that relationship between employer and employee has significantly changed over the years.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There, it used to be that maybe it wasn't, across the board, but it was much more likely, back when, say our grandparents were uh, in the working force, and you worked for a company and you worked for that company until you retired or couldn't work anymore, and then that company took care of you. There were pensions and
Pensions and unions.
retirement plans,
Yes,
and
pensions and unions from graduation to grave and employment.
yep,
Uh, but pensions and unions changed. The pensions, it's sometime in the 80s, I think, pension plans, company pension plans moved to 401ks,
right.
which are not the same thing. They are investments and you manage it yourself and so on. Well, it's an investment in the stock market,
Yep.
which puts the interests of employees, aligns them with the interests of businesses. And it's um, that's been a problem.
Well,
People
it's
at
also
least can
something.
take their 401k with them when they move to a new employer, but yeah, it's an issue. Um,
It's Yeah, because they're complex. A 401k, running a 401k is complex.
yeah,
It's often usually done by another company,
yes,
right? And your money just, for most people, your money just sort of goes into it, and you get a statement on it annually, and that's it. Um, you'll get a usually get some kind of announcement that says what your this company is investing in, what your 401k is currently tied up in,
Mhm.
um, and it's important to learn what those things are. But yeah, it and it was sold to us like a lot of things in the 80s that, oh, this is going to be so much better for you because if your company goes under or somebody steals your pension, you don't just lose it,
Yeah.
and you can manage it yourself. It's this is the you can be an entrepreneur with your money. You can take it and you can invest it and you can do all
Yeah.
these things and grow it at your own pace, and it's your money and you should decide what gets done with it.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
remember them saying, the people who wanted to privatize Social Security saying, and there's still people who want to do that, saying, well, look how much better you'd do if you were investing that money. And then there was the collapse of, well,
Right.
pick a
2008.
decade, pick a
Yeah.
decade.
Right.
And um so that was one thing. The decline in unions has been another thing. Although they're on a bit of an upswing now, but union percentage of workers in unions had declined dramatically. Again, the 80s and Reagan busting the air traffic controllers union. Uh,
Well, and just across the board, conservative legislatures voting for the so-called right to work.
yeah,
And again,
right
sold
to
to us
work for
as
less. Yeah,
sold to us as you don't have to pay these union dues in order to work at this factory anymore.
yeah,
Let's imagine how much money you'll save. But that also went hand in hand with right to work is also sort of right to fire. It's
yeah,
the at will at
at will
will work.
employment, right.
Yeah, so they went hand in
So,
hand.
so the average, I looked up figures for what the average job tenure is. And do you know what it,
I have
uh,
no idea
okay,
what it
so
is now.
what it is now.
Okay.
So well, I've got figures from 2019 and from 2020 to 2022. Things have changed, but figures from the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation and Economic Development. So globally, the country in 2019 with the longest job tenure was Italy,
Okay.
12.2 years.
Oh, wow. Do you have a comparison to say the 50s? Like,
I don't have that,
okay, all right.
but I know that there were people who, at least anecdotally, I know there were people who were with the same company their whole
Oh,
working life.
my grandfather went worked at Chrysler Motors, went to World War II, came back, got his same job back, and retired from there.
Yeah.
So he
And
he
that,
worked from about the age of 17 to 55.
well, so I can share here this chart. So this is where people stick with their jobs, average time spent with one employer in selected countries. Italy, 12.2, and again, 2019. So it's pre-pandemic, pre the
Sure.
Great Resignation, which we
Yeah.
talk about. But you can see that in the United States isn't even on the list of top 10 here,
Well, that's top
or
eight,
top eight.
but I bet
Um,
we're not in the top 10.
well, the average, what I found was that, let me find this here. Um, in 2022, the median, and this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the median number of years that wage and salary workers had been with their current employer in January 22 was 4.1 years, unchanged from the median in 2020,
Hmm.
4.1 years. Um, some are tenure is generally higher for older workers and for certain kinds of professions like public sector, but it's other occupations much lower. Food service workers had the lowest median tenure at 1.6 years.
And that's at a company, at a particular company.
Yes, yes.
I wonder what tradesmen, how tradesmen fare that they don't work for the same company, but they continue working in their field for their whole
Well,
life.
that's different because a lot of people will change employers.
Sure.
Um, so and I was pretty unusual in when I worked in advertising and marketing because I was with firms for a long time. And then there, I remember once I was working late and a colleague was walking by my office and he saw me working and he stepped in my office and he said, if you drop dead right now, they would step over your body to get to your phone to call and hire someone else.
Yep.
And he was right that, it wasn't loyalty and certainly found that um, there's a commonly understood truism in advertising that people don't retire from advertising because by the time they're in their 50s, they're gone. They're
Hmm.
let go. Um, but that really is a point here is that when you are employed by someone, your professionals have a loyalty to the work and to
Well,
the
yeah, there's a
quality of
difference.
what they do, but not necessarily to their employer because it's not reciprocated.
Right. There's a you and I have talked. This is one of the things we've talked about before. When we talked about loyalty as a virtue, and I'm going to backtrack, but I'll come back. We talked about loyalty as a virtue, but we sort of decided that unconditional loyalty in pretty much any situation is dangerous. That loyalty is something that you bestow on someone or some organization or whatever because it it aligns with your ethics,
Yes.
right? And the other sort of parallel or side aside that is loyalty is being as good as your word. Is that
Hmm.
when you make a contract with someone, even just a social contract, an agreement, you stick by it, and that's what loyalty. When we talk about loyalty as a virtue, that's what it is. So it that makes sense and ties with the idea of professional ethics and
Yeah.
doing your best work for that's what your employer is supposedly paying for is your best work. But if he's only paying for it between this hour in the morning and this hour in the evening, and you give them that best work during that time, and then you're not there anymore.
There are, yeah, there are certainly professional situations where work has to be done. There's a deadline
Right.
because one of the first rules is you never ever miss a deadline. Of course, the second rule is you got to make sure the deadline is real. And I've talked about some of those situations
Yeah.
before. Um, so you stay and you work and you get it done, even if it means longer hours, weekends, so on. But the converse of that is that if the work isn't there, you're you have time and you have flexibility and so on, or supposed to.
Well, it's
um,
reciprocal, at
it
least
should
with.
be reciprocal. It should be reciprocal. And my colleague who talked about fealty did not understand the reciprocity that was required for a contract of fealty. Um, and certainly in the economic system we are in, employers will take advantage. Um,
I'm sure I've shared this story before. Um, I'm sure I've shared it with you. I don't know if I've shared it on our podcast here, but I had a conversation, and I figured this out years ago,
Oh,
long
yeah,
before, and the capitalist relationship between employer and employee. And I was talking with an employer about my current compensation. And I said to him, and he was quite shocked that I would say this right to his face. It said, in this economic system, my job as the employee is to work as little as possible for as much money as I can get. And his job is to work me as hard as I will put up with for as little as he can get away with paying. That is the adversarial relationship between employer and employee. Now, the two of us, then find a middle ground where I'm willing to work this hard for this amount of money, and you're willing to accept this amount of work for that same amount of money. And we agree, and we settle there.
yes. I
And then
think
as my
it's
skills increase or my workload decreases or whatever, we renegotiate. And that's fair and reciprocal.
yeah, and I think that's one philosophical approach. I take a different one. Um, I see the validity of what you're saying, but it's not how I think about those things. And as an example, I'll tell you, company I worked at did a lot of um, incentive programs, like a sales incentive program where you sell so much of this, Mr. Salesperson, you get these rewards for it. And the company's expert in incentivization um, gave a presentation. It was mandatory. We had to attend this. And I read the literature on it, and it's like, okay, I see. Because it recognized intrinsic drive for work, but that was magnified. The benefit was magnified by these extrinsic rewards. Okay. But in his presentation, he said the complete opposite. He said, people only do what they do for the rewards they get. They only were espousing what you are saying. That's what he was saying.
Well,
And that, yeah. But I went to him at the break, and I said, well, what about people who are internally driven to do their best every day and every day to do better because they take a pride in their work and a satisfaction from doing well, and they want to do better and they want to improve what they're doing. And he looked at me and he said, what do you do for the company? I said, I'm an art director. He went, you creatives, you're not like real people. And I, I completely disagree because I think the intrinsic appeal of work, if somebody's getting to do their best work, I think empowering that is something that employers can do. Giving what I have wanted from employers most often is to give me the tools and resources I need and get the hell out of my way and let me do great work.
sure.
If they can do more than that to help me, great. But so often they get in the way. And he, this expert, did not seem to understand that because if he hadn't been doing this, he would have been doing almost anything, whereas creatives are driven to be creative. However, I think it's that people like who have that drive can be even more easily exploited because
Well,
they don't, yeah, they can be more easily exploited because give them the tools, give them the resources, give them the challenges, let them do creative work. They can be exploited. And
and I agree I agree that an artistic profession or something, a creative profession, I should
yeah,
say, um, does have that sort. I don't want to call it a trap. It can be very rewarding. It can be very satisfying. We've both, we've both been in those positions where doing a good job feels good.
yeah,
You know, part of it is because you're not just production. You're not just, you know, I made more widgets today than the guy next to me, so I got a reward. It's not the same thing. You're creating something out of your head that has to solve a problem, and it solves the problem, and you get a certain mental feedback
Yeah,
from doing
yeah,
that job well.
yeah,
And I wanted to point out too that when I was talking about my conversation with my employer, that's as little as possible. What I meant is time spent.
oh,
That
oh,
the work while you're there, I don't mean like I'm going to try and be as lazy as possible all day. I just mean I'm going to work as few hours to get my work done for as
yeah,
much money as I can make.
yeah.
When there's no work to do, I don't want to be there. But that's what I'm talking
I once had I worked for a company that bought the the only model of Macintosh computers that was discontinued because they were dogs. They were terrible. So this company bought a whole bunch of them for the creative department, and they were terrible, slow, and
about.
awful. So, we learned things how to reboot them and keep them running and stuff. But I was working on a large retouching job, and the memory on this thing was so low, I had to do it in pieces and then save off the pieces and then eventually clear and keep restarting to clear the cache, clear the memory, clear the
Oh
because that
wow.
was I had to do. And then eventually put all the pieces together into the final retouched file. And it took me, if I had a proper computer, I could have done the whole thing in about 4 hours. It took me 3 days to do.
Right.
And
Right.
I wrote this up. Hours spent, time, cost of new things, cost, time wasted, times the number of employees in the creative department, times and I presented this and they said, yeah, it's just your hours. It's soft dollars. It doesn't really matter. It's not, if we have to spend hard money on equipment, that's actual money. You guys, it's just your time and you'll work here until, the job is
Right.
done.
Right. See,
So,
exactly. The other
um,
thing I wanted to touch on when you were talking about incentive programs, whenever I hear about incentive programs are always bracketed so
yes,
that when you hit this threshold, you get a reward. You don't get any reward until you get to that threshold. And this is the I don't remember if it was Sun Tzu or if it was Genghis Khan. I think it was Genghis Khan actually, who said if you want your warriors to capture chariots, tell them that the person who brings me the most chariots, captures the most chariots from the enemy, will get this bag of gold. That way, everybody is chasing chariots and trying to get them, but only the one guy who gets the most gets the gold. So they're
it,
all working as hard
it,
as they possibly can, and only one gets a reward. And it's the
it
same thing.
it's like the scene in, I think it's Glenn Ross, where the head of the sales team says the winner gets, I forget what it was, like a new car. Second place gets a set of steak knives. Third place is fired. You know,
That's
um,
a pretty small force.
yeah. Well, if you come in after that, yeah. Um, I think that so the idea of getting back to this, the tenure with a company that, and well, let's move on to say the Great Resignation.
Okay.
Um, I think that people talk about younger people as being less driven, and I don't see that. I see a real drive, um, um, a lot of perseverance, but also um, fear in younger people, my students. They're so driven to get through school and get in the workforce because they know they're going to have debts
Yep.
and they want to get to minimize those and get to paying them off. But they also want to do work that's meaningful. They don't want to spend 40 years working a job that's drudgery and then only pursue their interests um, after hours. Um, I think there are also a lot of people now who are working from home, and the pandemic absolutely changed the relationship between employers, employees, in that to the extent even that there's now a glut of office space available.
Yeah.
Companies are downsizing their footprint because people are working from home or only going in a couple days a week, or only going in for meetings and things like that.
I know
And
that. Well, let me put in there that um, my beautiful wife is a employee at Ford Motor Company and used to drive every day into Dearborn. And since the pandemic, working at home has become the rule.
yeah,
And Ford has a whole separate business that's just, they call it Fordland. It's just the properties that Ford owns to house its employees. And they're requiring people to come in now, not like I hear something so that managers can justify their presence in the workforce, but I think, and I haven't looked into this, but I think there is a tax reason they can't sell off the buildings that they don't really need anymore because who's going to buy them?
yeah.
So they need to occupy those buildings a certain amount to get a tax deduction on the expense of the building.
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
Otherwise, it's taxed a different way. I think that if it just sat there empty, it would be taxed one way. If it's
hmm
got actual people working in it within a company, it's taxed some other way. So I think that's the reason for pulling people back in because she's only going back in 1 day a week, not
yeah,
enough
yeah.
to, and everybody is doing that, but they're not all going back in on the same day. So it's not. It's,
There's some places where people coordinate the days they go in because they have um, face-to-face collaboration things, but the tools now for remote connection
like
are
we're doing right now.
so much better than the days where many years ago I was on the phone to vendors and people, and it was what I called art direction by Rolodex. There was there were I was amazed the first time I encountered an art director who couldn't draw, but she had a Rolodex and she could call people and describe
Wow.
her ideas to them, and then they would draw it. So,
Like the
uh,
original AI creators.
yeah, sort of. Um, which
Remote
is
and
another topic we should
we can talk about.
talk about. Um,
Well,
so I
remember in
think,
the 90s and the 2000, early 2000s when to get people to come to the offices, the people, uh, places like Google and a lot of the Silicon Valley places were turning their workplaces into these like sort of giant creative playgrounds where you didn't have an office, you just sat on a beanbag chair in the lounge or next to the foosball table, and you just
well,
somehow.
I think it wasn't. Yeah, there were, and my beautiful wife, brilliant wife, and I have talked about this. She's an architect. We've talked about open office spaces and um, the the things that make that work that are being done now are very different from the things when they were first tried. Because
Yeah,
when they were first tried, people found a spot they liked and camped out there, and that became their spot. Um, I think that the other thing that those companies did to encourage their employees to work longer
yeah,
was they put in a gym and daycare and dry cleaners and food and other things so that people never had to leave. They didn't have to go out for lunch. They didn't have to go run errands. They didn't have to, they could do, there was a medical clinic there. They could, I mean, there were all sorts of things that people could do there. And I think that was meant to encourage people to stay in the office longer. And it worked.
Yeah, well, it's certainly better than, working in a gray cubicle all day. I
Yeah.
mean,
Well, and I think when I was in graduate school, I was taking a class, the penultimate class of the program, called Ethics, Regulation, and Society.
hmm,
I had probably 25 years at minimum more work experience than most of my cohort, most of my classmates. And there was a question about, and this was long enough ago that this was a question, um, is it ethical to use your employer's phone to make personal calls during business hours?
oh,
And they said, oh, no, you shouldn't do that. I went, well, wait a minute here. You're talking about work-life separation, not work-life balance,
right.
which was the buzzword. But I think what we're really moving to is work-life integration, where and I recognize this, if I can empower an employee to spend a few minutes taking care of something personal during the day, then they will work with a clear mind. They won't have to leave to take care of it. Won't have to take a day off. They will work with a clear mind because they made a phone call. That cost the company fractions of a penny in terms of the particularly local phone calls. It was just part of the overhead. Um, and so and now of course people have cell phones, but there were questions back then about, well, installing games and software on your computer. That was really before people started thinking about viruses. There were, I think that the people without the experience in the workplace don't understand what it is to balance your intense work to completion of a project on deadline with the need to take care of personal life as well. And a lot of employers didn't understand that either because a lot of the executives had wives who were professional wives, essentially,
Yeah, right.
who took care of all that stuff. They took care of the children, they took care of the house, they took care of the bills, they took care of all, all that stuff. So the executive didn't have to worry about it. All the executive he had to worry about was making
Sure.
money and doing things. And that relationship is incredibly outdated as well by
Yeah.
then. Um,
Well,
so
there's another aspect of, back to the reciprocity we were talking about. If I don't feel like I have to be nose to the grindstone every minute of every day, I'm likely to work those few minutes at the end of the day to finish something so that it can move on to another
right.
process first thing tomorrow morning or whatever, you know. And again, we are different as creatives, where you get in a zone when you're
Yeah.
working on a
Yeah.
project, right? And it's hard for you to break in and out of that. It's not like somebody working in an office where it's you spreadsheet analyze, move on to the next spreadsheet. It's not like,
They
well,
still get it. They can get in the zone too.
sure, but the
So
difference is, the if they do this spreadsheet today and they do that spreadsheet tomorrow, it won't make any difference. There's no, you know what I mean? They might finish this operation that they're doing, but there's no there's no harm and no difference in waiting to do that next spreadsheet till tomorrow.
I think when doing design work, for example, there are a lot of pieces you keep in your head,
Right. That's
in your
that's
short-term memory that you are then juggling. I do this, I have to adjust this, I can move this. You're keeping a lot of things the plate spinner, juggler, those are spinning in your head.
Right.
And if you stop spinning them to do something else, you're interrupted, then you have to put them back up. You start them spinning again. I've explained to students, I've asked students, who's a multitasker? They all the bunch raised their hands. I
Sure.
said, yeah, that no, you aren't.
It's a myth.
You are a serial single tasker. But every time you switch from one thing to another, it's like driving a car on a surface street with a lot of stop signs. You have to
Yeah.
stop, you have to accelerate again, you have to stop at the next one too. It's like that versus getting on the highway, driving, getting to your destination. You get there quicker, then you drive and do another one. And I said, try, please try intense single tasking. Set yourself a timer for 20 minutes and do one thing with no phone, no music, no phone, no lights, no motor car, not a single luxury. No, that's an old TV reference, but focus on one thing for that amount of time, and you will find that you're more productive when you do that.
Sure.
Um, I had an employer once who I was thinking, I was that zone you get in where you're thinking and you're in your head. And he walked by and said, you should get to work. And whatever thought I had was,
Yeah.
I lost the thread of it. I was working.
Yep.
So I, at that point, learned whenever I have to do that, I hold a pencil and have a pad of paper in front of me. And then it looks like I'm working. They say, oh, well, you see, he's working. So, um, and I also found that if I was thinking, but not writing down what I was thinking, I was only thinking about thinking. But um, so I think it's understandable. I think that another factor in why people change jobs. Certainly, some people are leaving an employer is not a choice,
Right.
whether it's age or the economics of something. It's not a choice. But when it is a choice, there's a saying that people don't quit their companies, they quit their bosses. And that's often the case too. Um, I think that the other aspect of that is that the idea that you stay with one company and they will recognize your work and they will reward you with money and promotions is not true. The quickest way to increase your compensation and responsibility is going to another employer.
Yep.
And that's why one of the reasons why people change. Stay with the same employer for a long time and they take you for granted,
And
even
it's,
though it costs them more money to find and hire a new employee than it does to keep a good one
well, certainly in this
employee.
market,
Yeah.
and depending on the
Well,
job,
it's been true for a while. So,
well, yeah, but I guess when you think in terms of like unskilled labor, I guess if you think in terms of like fast food preparation, where the philosophy was always with employers that I can replace you in 10 minutes.
yeah.
There's no I can train up somebody to do, and the jobs were designed just that way that you could learn them quickly and easily. So I will fire you and I will replace you by tomorrow afternoon and not lose any productivity. I'm not worried about your quitting. So they would exploit those people
Yeah.
until they
Yeah.
quit, and then they would just hire another one and exploit them.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say that grandfather of mine who worked at the same place for 40 years, right, gave me the advice, said, when you get a new job, the first thing you should do is start looking for a better job.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And but he said, but he sort of caveated that. He said, now you hope that that better job will be at the same company. You hope that, but don't wait for it.
Yeah.
If you find a better job, and this I sort of learned on my own, is that if you find a better job, you can tell your employer, hey, I've got this other position lined up. I'm going to give you the right to, first bid on matching it or surpassing it, or I'm going to go. That's why wouldn't I? I've done
Yeah.
that a couple of times, but you're right. It's your employer's in a position and they are fixed in that position, and it's harder for them to make an easy adjustment somehow
Yeah.
than it is for a company who's already prepared to make a offer.
Yeah. I remember once I was in a position to make promotion and salary recommendations for people, and I did. And one really good art director who I said, "This is the salary increase I'm recommending," and they blinked really hard. Management said, "That's a lot." I said, "This particular art director is really good. This person is not only good at the creative work, but clients really, really like them.
Mm.
Clients like working with them. Clients request working with them." um, what I'm suggesting is bringing this person up to the salary commensurate in the marketplace
Right.
with that person's skill and experience and ability, because they could go out tomorrow and get another job at more than I'm recommending you. You've been underpaying this person for years. It's time to do right, or you will lose them. Because if you don't pay them, I'm going to tell them exactly what they're worth.
Well, there's also in an
They actually
industry,
coughed up the money for it, which is good.
oh, amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
There's also in an industry like advertising, and I suppose it's the same, at the upper levels of any particular industry, that you're keeping them from your competition as well.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not just about giving them what they're worth. If they go somewhere else, you're down. You've lost the draft.
Yeah.
They're going to be playing for another team, and you don't want that either.
So I think, we're talking about and I think it's interesting because loyalty as a virtue, all the virtues really are principles.
Sure.
And or I've said they're verbs too. They are action words, not just ideas that sit there on a shelf. But we're talking about the real practicality of the application of loyalty in an employer-employee situation, employment situation. And I think that's a, a useful way to think about how we apply the virtues to modern life.
Sure. And not just this has a very straightforward practical application, what
Yeah.
we're talking about here with
Yes.
loyalty to your employer. Okay, your livelihood
And
is how you,
employers' loyalty to employees.
exactly. So one can be honest without expecting honesty as a principle. You're honest. That's how you live your life. You don't necessarily expect someone to be honest with you, but you can decide how you go forward with somebody who's been dishonest with you. And that's the same what we're talking about
Yeah.
here. If your employer has no loyalty to you, you do not owe your employer anything.
Yeah. You only owe them your work. But
You don't
if they,
owe them that. You
you're
are
compensated for
exchanging
it.
that.
There, I think that you owe yourself honesty in that you will respect the resources owned by the company. You will not misappropriate them.
Right.
You will meet your deadlines. You'll do the work. You will, all of those things, you owe that to yourself. Um, I may have mentioned this before. I knew a couple of guys who were fired because they were doing freelance work, but they were using not only that they were using company equipment to do their freelance work,
Right.
they were using um, resources, imagery that had been purchased by clients for the client's use. They were using it for their own freelance clients, so they didn't
Yeah.
have to pay for it. And they were making prints and they were doing all sorts of things. They were fired. And other the one fellow, you know, that's part of his brand that I've been fired from all these different agencies as if I was too creative for them. They
Yeah.
didn't understand
I was
my
this maverick.
genius, right? I was a maverick. No, you were a thief.
Yeah. You were unemployable.
Yeah. So, um, so there's loyalty to yourself and to your own principles and your own ideals and your own virtues. And that I think is essential.
Yeah. And that can guide you in your professional life.
Yeah.
And whether you keep with it, whether you work for someone that, if you're working for a company that requires you to be dishonest with yourself, you can't last.
I've
I'd be
yeah,
miserable.
I've I've told students that inevitably in their working life, they will encounter ethical dilemmas that they need to start thinking about right now. And I tell them of an example where I had hired an outside design firm to do some work. The budget was approved, the work was good. And then the account executive, when the work was delivered, the account executive said, "Well, I'm not going to pay them." I,
Yeah.
I was aghast. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, what are they going to do? Sue me? They'll never get any work again." And and the reason he could say that is because every one of the automotive companies at some point took work that was proposed, had it produced by someone else, and didn't pay for it. Every single one. I know it happened to me. I have lots of examples, but nobody ever sues because you never work for the
Well, it's a,
automotives again. And there's a single industry city, that was problematic. But so he said this, and I was shaking mad. And I went to his boss, knocked on the door, said, "Can I talk to you?" He said, "Yes." I went and closed the door and I explained the situation. I said, "If this company will not stand behind its commitments, I cannot work here." And I needed the job at the
yeah.
time. I needed the job. And he looked at me and he said, "This company will stand behind its commitments. If we promise to pay somebody, we will." I said, "Thank you very much." And I went back to work and the vendor got paid. And a month later, that account executive was no longer working there.
We had
So that
we have a
was
client.
that was good.
Yeah. And right on. Good work. We had a client, and this is another sort of straight up ethical thing where we've got this customer, or he had this customer where I work now, and he would come in once a month or so with some kind of political sign to hold up, and um, a lot of it is kind of shake your head conspiracy theorist kind of stuff. And we're like, okay, whatever. He spends $30 on a sign once a month, and it's just black type on a white board. It doesn't take me any time to do it, you know. And he came in one time, but the message he wanted printed crossed the line into Holocaust denial. and I told my boss, I said, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to touch this. If if you want to do it, you can do it. It's your company, but this is going to change our relationship.
Yeah.
And he went, no, no, we shouldn't. No, we shouldn't do that. We're not going to print that. And I said, okay, you're going to tell him, or do you want me to tell him? And he goes, no, no, I'll tell him.
Well, good for you and thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we've talked about the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, right?
And
And
well, we haven't talked about it
no, no, I know
on camera,
you
but
and I.
and yes, and if people really wanted, we could get into it.
I don't think people want
No,
to.
no, I don't think
I
that
don't
they,
blame them.
but yeah, um, I think I just short answer, you can be opposed to the policies of the Israeli government. I am certainly in a lot of ways. Zionism is simply the desire for indigenous people to have a homeland in their own country, in their own indigenous land.
Yeah,
And that's all that means. And people think it means a lot more than that because they're the problem is not it's confusing criticism of the government with criticism of the idea that the country should exist. And you can disagree with the government, but saying the country shouldn't exist, that is anti-Semitic
yeah,
because of all the people in the world who, you're only singling out these people to say they don't have a right to a country. Yeah. So without getting into that too much more deeply. But if anybody wants to talk to me about it, I'm happy to talk to you about it. And because I've got a lot of information. So, and
well,
strong
and like I said,
opinions, conclusions backed by evidence. So,
and like I said, this wasn't even that. It was
yeah,
Holocaust denial. And I'm like,
yeah,
no, we're not. That's not even a political discussion. That's
yeah,
craziness.
yeah.
So,
Okay.
so on that happy note,
Yeah. Well, I think we have tangented off into
right.
another area. So
Well,
it's time, I
we've
think, to
certainly been we've certainly gone off onto tangents enough to satisfy our usual audience, I think.
so um and with that, then I will say please like, subscribe, share, send us your suggestions for topics, and until we see you next time, be thou
A good night.
and true.